In 2019, we are continuing to see an evolution of the threat landscape. Certainly, threats that were big in previous years, for example, ransomware, are significantly declining. We've seen a decline in the number of ransomware-related incidents we detect, and we've also seen a decline in the number of unique families of ransomware being released onto the market, if you like, which says there are fewer criminals actively investing in the deployment and development of ransomware. But what we're seeing an increase in, well, probably two things. One is cryptojacking, crypto mining based attacks, although I think that's already beginning to tail off. The other thing, which is more significant and actually has local relevance because of recent events, is more targeted and effective attacks against organizations that still leverage ransomware as one of the tools in that toolkit. So I'm speaking specifically, obviously, about Norsk Hydro attack that happened very recently. And these kinds of attacks that are sometimes called fileless attacks, certainly some elements of the attack are fileless, very targeted, a lot of reconnaissance and research work done about the target organization up front, usually using something like a phishing attack up front to get hold of credentials, and then being able to break into an organization, escalate privileges, very often using what are called fileless techniques, so using admin tools like WMI or PowerShell to download scripts which are executed only in memory, to deploy criminal tools across the infrastructure. Even ransomware can be deployed filelessly. Lokagoga is not an example of that, but it can be done filelessly using scripts that are deployed solely using enterprise tools, and therefore trying to overcome traditional security technology and techniques. So we need to be looking more from a behavioral perspective than historically we have done in 2019.
Okay. But how would you say, how does the future security protection for companies and organizations, how do they look in your eyes?
It was, part of the point of the presentation today is that the future will always comprise elements of the past as well. Just because a new technique is developed or deployed, it doesn't mean that you should immediately throw away all of the things that you've been doing successfully up until then. But what it does mean is that you have to look at the environments within which you're deploying security and make sure that if you're relying on techniques you've been using for some time or tools you've been using for some time, that they're still fit for purpose in those new environments. If they're not, then of course you need to look at the innovations that are out there. How do you secure a container environment? How do you secure a DevOps workflow? How do you secure a cloud environment? And you also need to continue to look at the evolving threat landscape, the fileless stuff, for example, I've been talking about, and say, is my security up to the job of securing against attacks that don't write any of their content to disk, for example? So, of course, there's still a place for what has unfortunately become termed legacy technologies. Very often they're computationally less expensive. Blacklisting, for example, it's very quick and easy to do a lookup for A on a blacklist to say, is this known bad? Yes. Okay, I'm going to block it, whether that's a file or a URL or an IP address, whatever it may be. So let's keep doing that, but let's make sure that we totally take into account the fact that threats are now engineered to overcome security technologies and will continue to be engineered to overcome new security technologies, and let's layer on top of those existing techniques every new tool that we can to make sure that we are still maintaining as much security as possible. Nothing is ever foolproof, nothing is ever silver bullet, but the real key to success is continuing to layer those techniques one on top of another, doing the less computationally expensive things first and saving the big guns until the end, so that you're doing those computationally expensive tasks on far less data at the end of the day.
In a different area, you often hear that technology solutions within AI and IoT are often vulnerable. What changes need to be done for high security in that part, say IoT, for example?
IoT is a great example because a lot of the organizations who are building connected devices, and actually a lot of the organizations who are shipping legacy devices and having legacy devices now being in a connected infrastructure, because that's another part of the same problem, never really had security on their radar. So in the case of newer devices, it's about being first to market, creating a market in certain instances, having the thing out there available to be bought and capturing customers.
Yeah.
Security is perceived as a roadblock, perceived as something which stops you being first to market. So very often these connected devices are built with little to no regard for security at all, whether that's authentication, encryption, whether that's testing of code for vulnerabilities, and protection of those vulnerabilities while it's out there. And in the case of legacy devices, they were never designed with security in mind in the first place because they weren't really supposed to be deployed in a connected environment. So what do we need to make security more effective? A lot of that comes down, unfortunately, to regulation and legislation. If you look at, for example, rechargeable devices or rechargeable batteries, if they don't meet a certain set of safety requirements, within the EU at least, and in other areas as well, if they don't have a certain stamp on them that says, this has passed all of these tests, you're not allowed to sell it if it doesn't have that safety mark on it. We need something, and it's in the process of being delivered through the EU actually. We need something which is the same for connected devices. If it doesn't meet these minimum security standards, and they are a minimum, not a maximum, then you can't sell it in this market. We are still going to end up being left with a legacy, a toxic legacy of connected devices that will hang around within homes and businesses for many years to come. So we need to develop compensatory security mechanisms around that. But at least going forwards, we will know that we have this regulatory environment that means that the things that are being sold meet these minimum standards. Because if you go to buy a new washing machine, the majority of people aren't even going to know which questions to ask as regards security, let alone wanting to ask the questions in the first place. That's why this regulatory environment is really the best first step for that.
Yeah, and we're getting there.
Yep. That stuff is being developed within the EU as we speak. Yeah,
if we look at globally, you often hear Russia, North Korea, perhaps Romania are identified as countries of origin of threats. Has that changed?
There are a lot of countries that are the origin of threats. There are some that are, historically true, that are maybe less true now. Brazil, for example, is kind of the spiritual home of banking malware. China has been responsible for the development of a large amount of mobile malware, focused primarily on Android. Obviously, the organized crime of Russia and Ukraine historically is super famous, and Romania is another one that falls into that category. But there are online criminals everywhere. They benefit from tools and techniques and research that may have been carried out maybe in those isolated geographies, but they all cross-pollinate, and there is development in Germany, there is development in the UK, there is development in Sweden, and there are criminals in those geographies as well. In fact, the major problem for the prosecution of online crime is attribution. For law enforcement, is being able to say, whose fingers were actually on the keyboard, and also to define exactly what crime was being committed and in whose jurisdiction is another really difficult, not intractable, but really difficult question that requires a lot of cooperation, transnational cooperation between law enforcement agencies, because at the end of the day, they're the only entities that are capable of pursuing something to prosecution. But we see successful prosecutions in every country within the EU and beyond as well. Of course, there are national agendas as well. You mentioned North Korea. There's a lot of stuff that's attributed to North Korea. There's a lot of stuff that's attributed to Russia. On a nation-state level rather than simply on a cybercrime level. But what is also true, maybe North Korea, the hermit kingdom, is kind of an exception to all of this, like they're an exception to most things. But what is largely true is that a lot of the talent that is involved, I use talent in inverted commas, a lot of the talent that is involved is actually a hacker for hire scenario where we're talking actually about the same criminal actors who are being repurposed for a national agenda, because it gives you as a state, it gives you a layer of remove from the crime that's being committed and gives you plausible deniability. We heard Putin talking about patriotic Russians being part of the attacks of the past. So it gives them that plausible deniability as well.
Yeah. And briefly, if we look forward, you look forward a couple of 3 to 5 years, say, what do you see for new tools, security tools out there?
So machine learning, like most things, kind of the point of the presentation, has a pedigree in that it goes all the way back to the 1950s in terms of scientific research. For Trend Micro, it already goes back 15 years. We started using machine learning in anti-spam, and we've used it in many different iterations and use cases since then. Whether it's detecting exploits in the browser, whether it's detecting business email compromise emails, detecting malicious files, many different use cases over the course of that year. And that's true about any technology. Nothing comes out of nothing. I once heard someone say that the light bulb didn't come from continuous refinement of the candle, as if making the case for the fact that the light bulb appeared out of nowhere. But if you think about what a light bulb actually is, it's just an electric candle. So really it did come out of continuous refinement of the candle. So I guess what I'm saying with that is, from a security tool perspective, what you will see in the future, they will be iterations and refinements of the kinds of tools and technologies that you see today. What will be coming in the very near future will really be tools and technologies focused on where the industry is going in terms of how industry uses technology. So we're talking a lot about 5G, we're talking a lot about cloud edge computing, we're talking a lot about containers, Internet of Everything, Industry 4.0, connected factories. Those are the areas that the security industry needs to be looking at. How does my security work in a 5G environment? How do I provide effective security for network function virtualization, containerization, serverless environments? How do I take Norsk Hydro and the fact that they're basically making aluminium and stuff made out of aluminium, and take that environment that really security hasn't played much of a role in historically, and bring that into the fold? So short term, next 3 to 5 years, that's going to be a big area of focus.
Rick Ferguson, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, thank you.